I was 7 months pregnant when my husband said his dying ex-wife needed him more than I did. 3 days later, I went into premature labor alone. When he finally showed up, I handed him divorce papers and a DNA test proving the baby wasn't his. I'm Emma, 28 years old, and I thought I had the perfect marriage with Daniel. We'd been together for 4 years, married for 2, and I was carrying what I believed was our first child. Daniel worked as a nurse at the local hospital. I'm a high school teacher. We lived in a cozy house with a nursery we'd painted yellow because we wanted to be surprised about the gender. We'd met at a coffee shop near the hospital where I was grading papers and he was studying for his nursing boards. He'd noticed my stack of essays and made a joke about homework never ending. That conversation led to a 4-hour coffee date that turned into dinner, then breakfast the next morning. Daniel was charming, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my work and dreams. Our courtship was like something from a romance novel. Daniel would leave little notes in my car, bring me flowers for no reason, and plan elaborate weekend getaways to small towns. He proposed after 2 years of dating, on the beach where we'd had our first weekend trip together. I said yes immediately, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. The pregnancy had been going beautifully. Daniel was attentive, excited, constantly talking to my belly and reading parenting books that he'd highlight and share with me. He'd massage my feet every evening while we watched TV, bring me ice cream at midnight when cravings hit, and tell everyone he met that he was going to be a dad. Daniel painted the nursery himself, assembling the crib with meticulous care. He even hung glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling so our baby would have something magical to look at. But there was one complication that had always lurked in the background of our relationship: his ex-wife, Sarah. Sarah had terminal cancer, diagnosed 2 years into our marriage. Daniel and Sarah had been married for 3 years, divorcing just 6 months before we met. The divorce had been amicable, they said, just 2 people who'd grown apart. When Sarah got her cancer diagnosis, Daniel felt morally obligated to help her through treatments since she had no family and limited financial resources. I tried to be understanding about their continued connection. Cancer is horrible, and I didn't want to be the woman who stopped her husband from helping a dying person. Initially, Daniel's help was practical and limited. He'd drive Sarah to chemotherapy appointments once a week and check on her after particularly difficult treatment sessions. But Sarah's needs seemed to escalate as my pregnancy progressed. More doctor appointments Daniel needed to drive her to. More emotional support sessions that lasted hours. Sarah would call at all hours, crying about her prognosis, her fear of dying alone, or her regrets about their marriage ending when it did. Daniel would drop everything to rush to her apartment and comfort her, sometimes staying for entire evenings to talk through her emotions and fears. At first, I tried to be supportive of their connection. I even suggested Sarah stay with us during her worst treatment days so Daniel wouldn't have to constantly travel back and forth. But Sarah refused my offer, saying she needed Daniel's undivided attention and that having me around would make things awkward during such a difficult time in her life. She claimed that seeing our happy marriage and my pregnancy would be too painful when she was facing death alone and childless. I accepted this explanation, though it stung to be told that my presence was unwelcome during my husband's efforts to comfort his ex-wife. By my 7th month, I was struggling with pregnancy complications that required careful monitoring, high blood pressure, severe swelling, and constant fatigue that worried my doctor. My OB had ordered modified bed rest and frequent monitoring appointments to watch for signs of preeclampsia or other dangerous complications that could threaten both me and the baby. Daniel seemed increasingly distracted during my medical appointments, checking his phone constantly for messages from Sarah, and seeming impatient when doctors discussed my symptoms at length. When I expressed growing concern about my blood pressure readings and swelling, he'd reassure me quickly, then change the subject to Sarah's latest treatment updates. "Sarah calls me because she needs emotional support right now," he'd say when I asked for more of his attention. "The pregnancy is going fine. You're strong. Sarah is dying." I started feeling like I was competing with a dying woman for my own husband's attention, which made me feel like a terrible, selfish person. The frequency of Sarah's crises seemed to increase as my due date approached. Emergency calls about panic attacks, sudden fears about dying, or need for immediate comfort. Daniel would rush to her apartment at all hours, sometimes staying overnight when Sarah claimed she was too afraid to be alone with her dark thoughts. He'd come home exhausted and emotionally drained from these sessions, with little energy left for conversations about our approaching parenthood or my growing medical concerns. When I tried to discuss my feelings about being sidelined, Daniel would get defensive and accuse me of being jealous of a woman who was literally dying. "How can you be upset about me helping someone through their final months?" he'd ask. "This is temporary. Sarah won't be here much longer, but you and our baby will be." I felt guilty for wanting more of my husband's attention when he was trying to comfort someone facing death, but I also felt abandoned during the most vulnerable time of my life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I'd been having irregular contractions all day and was scared something might be wrong with the baby. I'd been timing the contractions for hours, noting they were becoming more frequent and intense. My blood pressure was elevated, and I was experiencing the kind of symptoms my doctor had warned me about. Daniel came home from work, and I immediately told him about the contractions and my concerns. He said they were probably just Braxton Hicks and that we should monitor them. We were making dinner together when his phone rang with Sarah's distinctive ringtone. She was sobbing hysterically, barely able to speak through her panic and fear. She'd just gotten back from her latest oncology appointment with devastating news that sent her into complete emotional collapse. The cancer had spread to her brain and spine. Her oncologist had given her maybe 6 weeks left to live, possibly less depending on how aggressively the cancer progressed. Sarah was terrified and begging Daniel to come over immediately to help her process this news and figure out how to handle her remaining time. Daniel looked at me, then at his phone, clearly torn between his pregnant wife having contractions and his dying ex-wife having an emotional breakdown. I told him to go be with Sarah, that she needed him right now more than I did. I was trying to be the understanding, supportive wife even while having contractions. But instead of leaving for a few hours to comfort Sarah, then returning home, Daniel packed an overnight bag with clothes and toiletries. Sarah wants me to stay with her tonight, he said apologetically. She's scared to be alone with this news. She's having panic attacks about dying. I was having contractions every 20 minutes by then, but Daniel seemed to think Sarah's emotional crisis took priority over my physical concerns about our pregnancy. I called my doctor's office and described my symptoms to the on-call nurse. She said to come in immediately to be monitored, just to be safe given my other complications. When I told Daniel I needed to go to the hospital for monitoring, he said he'd meet me there after he got Sarah settled and calmed down. She's having a complete breakdown, he explained. I can't leave her alone in this state, you understand, right? You're strong enough to handle this. I drove myself to the hospital at 7 months pregnant, having contractions, because my husband was comforting his dying ex-wife instead of caring for his pregnant wife. The drive was terrifying. Contractions were coming every 15 minutes, and I had to pull over twice to breathe through particularly intense ones. At the hospital, they hooked me up to monitors and confirmed the contractions were stress-related but not yet labor. However, the doctor was concerned about my blood pressure. You need to eliminate stress and get more rest, Dr. Martinez warned, or you risk premature delivery and other serious complications for both you and the baby. Daniel never showed up at the hospital that night. When I called him around midnight, he said Sarah was having repeated panic attacks, and he couldn't leave her alone. She's in a really fragile state, he whispered into the phone. I'm the only person she has. You're okay, right? The baby's okay? I went home around 2 a.m. and tried to rest, but I was hurt, angry, and worried about what this meant for our marriage and family. My husband had chosen his ex-wife's emotional needs over his pregnant wife's medical emergency. The message was clear about his priorities. The next morning, Daniel called to say he was staying another night with Sarah. She was having continuous panic attacks about her diagnosis and couldn't be left alone. You're strong and handling the pregnancy well, he said. Sarah is dying and falling apart. She needs me more than you do right now. Those words hit me like a physical blow. His dying ex-wife needed him more than his pregnant wife did. That's what he actually believed and stated out loud. I spent the day crying and having more contractions from the stress of feeling completely abandoned by my husband during the most vulnerable time of my life. My sister called to check on me and was horrified when I explained where Daniel was and why he wasn't home caring for his pregnant wife. That's not normal, Emma, she said bluntly. Husbands don't abandon their pregnant wives for ex-wives, dying or not. Something else is going on here. That evening, Sarah called me directly for the first time in our entire relationship. Her voice was weak but strangely determined as she thanked me for sharing Daniel. I know this is hard for you, she said, but Daniel and I have unfinished business. There are things we need to say to each other before I die. She paused, then added something that made my blood freeze. I need to tell you something important about your baby, Emma, something Daniel doesn't know yet. Before I could ask what she meant, she hung up abruptly. I tried calling back repeatedly, but Sarah didn't answer her phone. I called Daniel, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left increasingly frantic messages asking him to call me back immediately about something important. The next morning, I went into full labor at 32 weeks. My water broke while I was alone in our bedroom, and the contractions became intensely painful immediately. I called Daniel repeatedly while timing contractions and gathering my hospital bag, but he didn't answer his phone at all. I left frantic voicemails explaining that I was in labor and needed him immediately, that this was really happening, and I was scared. Finally, I called 911 and was rushed to the hospital by ambulance. I was alone, terrified, and giving birth 2 months early because of stress-related complications. During the ambulance ride, paramedics tried calling Daniel using the number I provided. They got his voicemail and left urgent messages about his wife being in active labor. At the hospital, I kept asking nurses to try calling Daniel. They attempted to reach him every few hours, but only got voicemail responses. He wasn't answering his phone while his wife was delivering their baby. He was unreachable during the most important moment of our lives together. After 18 hours of difficult labor, I delivered a beautiful but tiny daughter who weighed only 3.2 pounds and was immediately taken to the NICU. She needed breathing support and constant monitoring. The doctor said she was fighting hard, but that the next few weeks would be critical for her development. I'd given birth to our first child completely alone because Daniel was holding vigil with his dying ex-wife instead of being present for his family. I sat in my hospital room recovering from delivery, staring at photos of my daughter in the NICU, wondering how my marriage had come to this point. 48 hours passed before Daniel finally showed up at the hospital. He looked exhausted and emotional, but not because he'd been worried about his daughter's birth. Sarah died this morning, he said as soon as he walked into my room. I couldn't leave her during her final moments. She died peacefully, holding my hand. I stared at my husband in complete disbelief. Your daughter was born 2 days ago. She's been fighting for her life in the NICU while you held vigil with another woman. Daniel looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand why I was upset about his absence during our child's birth. Sarah was dying, Emma, he said defensively. She needed me there in her final hours. The baby is fine, isn't she? She's going to be okay? Our daughter weighed 3 pounds and had spent her first week of life on breathing support, while her father comforted his ex-wife instead of meeting his child. Fine? I repeated incredulously. She's in the NICU fighting to breathe. You missed her birth. You missed everything because you chose to be with Sarah instead. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair beside my bed. I know this looks bad, but you have to understand. Sarah had no one else. She was dying alone. I was giving birth alone, I replied. Your wife, your daughter. We were alone while you were with another woman during the most important moment of our lives. That's when I realized Daniel had made his choice crystal clear. He'd chosen Sarah over our family at the most crucial moment of our marriage. But Sarah's mysterious phone call had left me with questions I needed answered. What had she meant about something important concerning my baby? While Daniel went to see our daughter in the NICU for the first time, I called my sister and asked her to help me investigate something important. I hired a private investigator to look into Sarah's final weeks and Daniel's activities during my pregnancy. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew. Sarah hadn't just been getting emotional support from Daniel during her final months. They'd been having a full-blown affair, rekindling their romantic relationship. The private investigator found hotel receipts from nights when Daniel claimed to be staying at Sarah's apartment to comfort her through panic attacks. Restaurant charges for expensive dinners at romantic locations while I was home on bed rest, dealing with pregnancy complications alone. Even jewelry purchases Daniel had made for Sarah while I was struggling with medical issues and preparing for our baby's arrival. But the most shocking discovery was a letter Sarah had written to Daniel but never sent, found in her apartment after she died. The letter confessed that she'd lied about the cancer timeline to manipulate Daniel into rekindling their relationship before she died. She'd also revealed something that explained her mysterious phone call to me and changed everything about my pregnancy. Sarah knew the baby wasn't Daniel's because she'd been tracking my pregnancy timeline against Daniel's business trips and work schedules. She'd discovered that conception happened during a week when Daniel was out of town for a nursing conference, making it impossible for him to be the father. Sarah had been planning to tell Daniel the truth after the baby was born, hoping it would destroy our marriage and leave him free to grieve their relationship. But Sarah had died before she could reveal the paternity secret, leaving me with the knowledge that would change everything about my family. I quietly arranged for a DNA test on our daughter while she was still in the NICU. The results confirmed what Sarah had discovered and documented. Daniel was not the biological father of the baby he thought was his daughter. The timing made it impossible for him to have been the father. The real father was someone I'd had a brief encounter with during a rough patch in my marriage when Daniel had been distant and working excessive hours. It was a one-time mistake I'd regretted immediately and never told Daniel about. I'd convinced myself the baby was his because the timing seemed plausible. I'd been dealing with guilt about that mistake for months, but now I realized it wasn't actually a mistake. It was the truth Daniel needed to know. Now I was faced with a choice. Tell Daniel the truth and destroy our marriage, or let him continue believing he was the father while knowing he'd chosen another woman over us. The decision became clear when Daniel started talking about trying again for another baby, as soon as I recovered from the difficult delivery. Sarah's death made me realize how precious life is, he said. I want us to have a big family. Maybe we can start trying again in a few months. I couldn't build a future with a man who'd abandoned me during labor to comfort his ex-lover, especially when the child he thought was his actually belonged to someone else. I also couldn't let him continue making decisions about our family based on false information about paternity and his actual role in our lives. I consulted with my lawyer about the cleanest way to end the marriage without traumatizing our daughter or creating a custody nightmare that would follow us for years. The lawyer advised me to be honest about the paternity, but to frame it in a way that would make Daniel want to walk away, rather than fight for custody. If he's not the biological father and he's already shown he's unreliable during crises, he'll probably be relieved to be free of responsibility, she predicted. When Daniel came to visit me and the baby in the hospital for the third time since her birth, I was ready with divorce papers and DNA results. "What's this?" he asked, looking confused as I handed him the envelope containing both documents that would change his life. "Divorce papers and proof that you're not actually her father," I said calmly. "You're free to go be with whoever you want without any obligations to us." Daniel's face went through a series of emotions: shock, confusion, hurt, and finally something that looked almost like relief mixed with betrayal. He read the DNA results twice, then looked at our daughter sleeping in her incubator, connected to machines that were keeping her alive. "You cheated on me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "When? How long was it going on?" "You cheated on me first," I replied evenly. "With Sarah. I have hotel receipts and jewelry charges to prove it. The difference is I didn't abandon you during a medical emergency." Daniel tried to defend his affair with Sarah, claiming it was different because she was dying and needed emotional support that naturally turned physical. "It wasn't really cheating," he said. "Sarah was dying. She needed to feel loved and desired one last time. It was compassionate, not selfish." But I wasn't interested in his explanations or justifications. He'd made his choice when he missed our daughter's birth to comfort another woman. The paternity issue just made it easier for both of us to walk away, without the complications of custody battles and ongoing connections. "Do you want to be involved in her life?" I asked directly. "Because legally you have no obligation now that we know the truth about her biological father." Daniel looked at our tiny daughter again, then shook his head slowly. "I can't look at her without thinking about your betrayal," he said. "It's better if I just walk away completely." That was fine with me. I didn't want him around our daughter if he couldn't love her unconditionally anyway. She deserved better than a reluctant father. "I'll pack your things," I said. "You can can pick them up when I'm discharged. After that, we'll communicate only through lawyers until the divorce is finalized. Daniel nodded and left without saying goodbye to the baby he'd thought was his daughter. He walked away from both of us without looking back. The divorce proceedings moved quickly since Daniel was eager to be free of any financial or emotional obligations to a child that wasn't biologically his. He signed away all parental rights and walked away from our marriage without fighting for anything. He seemed relieved to escape the situation entirely. I moved back to my hometown to be near my family, who helped me raise my daughter while I finished my teaching degree and built a stable new life. My parents were shocked by Daniel's behavior, but supportive of my decision to leave him. They fell in love with their granddaughter immediately. My daughter spent her first few months in and out of hospitals, but she was a fighter. By 6 months old, she'd caught up to normal developmental milestones. She's now 5 years old and thriving. She's smart, funny, curious about everything, and surrounded by people who love her unconditionally without needing DNA tests to prove their commitment. I eventually told the real father about her existence when she turned 3. He was shocked, but interested in being involved in her life on a limited basis. He's married with kids of his own, but he pays child support and sees her occasionally. It's not a traditional family structure, but it works for all of us. His wife was initially upset about the situation, but she's come to accept that children aren't responsible for the circumstances of their conception. Daniel tried to reconnect with me about 2 years after the divorce. He'd apparently struggled with guilt and regret about walking away from what he thought was his daughter. He sent me long emails explaining that he'd made a mistake, that he'd been overwhelmed by grief over Sarah's death and hadn't been thinking clearly. I raised her for the first few weeks of her life, he wrote. I thought of her as my daughter. I'd like to be involved again if you'd be open to that. But by then, I'd built a life that didn't include him. I was dating someone who loved both me and my daughter exactly as we were. No conditions or complications. Daniel's attempt at reconciliation was too little, too late. He'd shown me his true character when he chose his ex-wife over his family during our greatest time of need. I responded to his emails once, explaining that he'd given up all rights to be involved in her life when he walked away. That decision was final and irreversible. You can't be a father when it's convenient for you, I wrote. Parenting requires commitment during the difficult times, not just when you're feeling nostalgic. The man I'd married had prioritized a dying woman's emotional needs over his pregnant wife's medical emergency. That wasn't someone I could trust with our future. Daniel had shown me that his love was conditional on circumstances beyond my control. He'd abandoned his family when competing priorities arose. Sometimes people ask if I regret not telling Daniel the truth about paternity earlier in our relationship. The answer is no. I don't regret the timing. Daniel abandoned us emotionally and physically when we needed him most, before he knew about the paternity issue. Finding out he wasn't the biological father just gave him a convenient excuse. But I don't believe he would have been a good father anyway, based on his behavior during the pregnancy and delivery. A good father doesn't miss his child's birth for any reason, especially not to comfort an ex-lover during their final moments. My daughter is better off without someone who could walk away so easily when things got complicated, or when better options presented themselves. She deserves parents who fight for her, not parents who abandon her when other priorities arise, or when they discover inconvenient truths. I learned that love isn't just about good times, romantic gestures, and perfect circumstances. Love is about showing up when things are difficult, scary, and inconvenient. Daniel failed that test catastrophically when he chose Sarah's deathbed over his daughter's birth. Everything else was just details that made the decision easier to live with. My daughter knows her story in age-appropriate terms. She knows her biological father and her mom's ex-husband are different people, and that's perfectly okay with her. What matters is that she's surrounded by people who chose to love her, not people who felt obligated to stay because of genetics or legal documents. Daniel lost the chance to raise an amazing little girl because he couldn't prioritize what actually mattered when faced with competing demands on his attention. That's his loss, not ours. We built a life without him that's filled with people who understand what commitment actually means during difficult times. Sarah got what she wanted in the end. She got Daniel's complete attention during her final weeks, even though it cost him his marriage and family. But I got something much better. I got free from a marriage with someone who didn't understand what commitment actually means when it's tested by real-life challenges. My daughter and I built a life filled with people who show up when we need them, who prioritize our well-being, and who don't abandon us for other relationships. That's worth more than any marriage based on false assumptions, misplaced priorities, and conditional love that disappears when circumstances change. The irony is that Daniel thought he was being noble and compassionate by caring for his dying ex-wife during her final weeks. But real nobility would have been being present for his child's birth, supporting his wife through a medical emergency, and prioritizing his actual family's immediate needs. He chose the dramatic, romantic gesture over the quiet, difficult work of being a reliable husband and father. That choice revealed everything I needed to know about his character. I don't hate Daniel anymore. I just feel sorry for him. He lost the chance to watch an incredible little girl grow up because he couldn't see what was actually important. He let guilt, nostalgia, and misplaced loyalty to a past relationship destroy his future with a family that needed him in the present moment. My daughter asks about him sometimes, and I tell her honestly that he wasn't ready to be a daddy when she was born. She seems satisfied with that explanation. Someday she might want to know more details, and I'll tell her the truth, that sometimes people make choices that change everything, and we have to build our lives around those choices. choices. Daniel made his choice the night he chose Sarah over us. Everything that happened after that was just the natural consequence of that fundamental decision. I made my choice too, to build a life for my daughter where she's never second priority to anyone else's crisis, emergency, or competing demands for attention. That's the difference between us. Daniel chose drama, guilt, and romantic gestures over responsibility and reliable presence. I chose stability and unconditional love over convenience. My daughter will grow up knowing she's someone's first priority, not their obligation or their burden when circumstances become complicated. That's the greatest gift I can give her, the knowledge that she deserves to be loved without conditions, without DNA tests, and without having to compete for attention. Daniel can live with his choices and their consequences. I'm too busy raising an amazing little girl who deserves all the love and attention I can give her. The man who said his dying ex-wife needed him more than his pregnant wife lost the chance to be needed by the most important person in the world, his daughter. But she doesn't need him anymore. She has plenty of people who understand that loving someone means showing up, especially when it's hard, inconvenient, or complicated. She has people who choose her every day, not people who abandon her when something more appealing or emotionally satisfying comes along. That's what real love looks like. Consistent, reliable, unconditional presence through good times and difficult circumstances alike. Daniel never learned that lesson, but my daughter will grow up surrounded by people who embody it every single day. Gender, female. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 years later, Daniel came crawling back with information that would shatter everything I thought I knew about Sarah's death. I was at the park with my daughter when I saw him approaching. She was playing on the swings, laughing as I pushed her higher and higher into the afternoon sun. Daniel looked terrible. Older, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of haunted expression that comes from carrying heavy secrets. "Emma, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "There's something about Sarah's death that you need to know. Something that changes everything." I told him to leave. My daughter didn't need to be exposed to the man who'd abandoned her before she was even born, who'd walked away without looking back. But Daniel persisted. "Sarah didn't die from cancer," he said urgently. "She killed herself, and she left a confession that explains everything about what really happened." The words stopped me cold. Sarah had committed suicide? That wasn't what Daniel had told me. He'd said she died peacefully from her illness, holding his hand. "You told me she died from the cancer," I said, stepping protectively closer to my daughter's swing. "You said she passed peacefully in her sleep." Daniel's face crumpled. "I lied. I've been lying for 3 years because I was ashamed, because what really happened was so much worse than anything you imagined." He pulled out a letter from his jacket pocket. The paper was worn, like it had been read and reread countless times over the years. "Sarah left this for me to find after she died," he said. "She planned everything. The cancer was real, but she exaggerated how close to death she was." The confession Sarah had left behind revealed a level of manipulation and cruelty that took my breath away even 3 years after the fact. Sarah hadn't been dying in 6 weeks like she'd told Daniel. Her cancer was treatable, and her prognosis was actually quite good with the right treatment plan. But she deliberately misled Daniel about her timeline, claiming she was terminal when she actually had years of potential life ahead of her. She'd used the false urgency of imminent death to manipulate Daniel into rekindling their relationship and abandoning his pregnant wife during a medical crisis. The letter detailed how Sarah had been planning this manipulation for months, watching our marriage and waiting for the perfect moment to insert herself back into Daniel's life. She'd known about my pregnancy complications and had deliberately escalated her demands for Daniel's attention during the times when I needed him most. Sarah had orchestrated the timing of her fake final crisis to coincide with my due date, ensuring Daniel would miss our daughter's birth to be with her instead. But the most shocking revelation was why Sarah had ultimately taken her own life instead of continuing with her manipulation. She'd discovered something that made her plan impossible to continue. Daniel had never actually loved her the way she'd hoped and believed. During their final weeks together, Sarah had confessed her feelings and her manipulation, expecting Daniel to choose her permanently over his family. Instead, Daniel had been horrified by what Sarah had done and told her he was going back to his wife and daughter immediately. "I told her I'd made a terrible mistake," Daniel said, his voice breaking, "that I loved you and our baby, and that I was going home to fix what I'd broken." Sarah had realized that all her manipulation had been for nothing. Daniel wasn't going to leave his family for her after all. Rather than face the consequences of destroying a marriage for nothing, Sarah had taken a bottle of pills and left the confession letter for Daniel to find. "She wanted me to live with the guilt," Daniel said, "to know that she died because I rejected her after she'd done all of this to get me back." I stared at the letter in disbelief. Sarah had destroyed our marriage, caused my premature labor, and then killed herself when her plan didn't work. And Daniel had been carrying this secret for 3 years, letting me believe he'd chosen another woman over his family when the reality was even more complicated. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Why not 3 years ago when it might have mattered?" Daniel looked at our daughter, who was now playing in the sandbox, completely oblivious to the adult drama unfolding nearby. "Because I've been in therapy," he said, "and my therapist made me realize that keeping this secret was another way of choosing Sarah over my family." He explained that he'd been protecting Sarah's reputation and his own guilt instead of being honest with me about what had actually happened. "I thought if you knew the truth, you'd blame yourself for Sarah's death," he said. "I thought I was protecting you from that guilt." But his therapist had helped him understand that withholding the truth was just another form of betrayal, another way of prioritizing someone else over over his wife. "I should have told you immediately," Daniel said. "You deserve to know what really happened and why I made the choices I did." The revelation didn't change the fundamental facts of our situation. Daniel had still abandoned me during labor. He'd still chosen another woman over his family when it mattered most. But it did explain why he'd seemed so confused and defensive about his choices. He'd been manipulated by someone he'd trusted, just like I had been. "Does this change anything?" Daniel asked hopefully. "Now that you know Sarah manipulated both of us, is there any chance we could try again?" I looked at my daughter, then back at Daniel, the man who'd missed her birth, who'd signed away his parental rights, who'd let us build a life without him. "No," I said firmly. "It doesn't change anything important. You still made the choice to leave when I needed you. You still abandoned your daughter." Daniel started to argue, but I cut him off. "You were manipulated, but you still had choices. You could have brought me with you to see Sarah. You could have answered your phone when I was in labor." The truth was that while Sarah had created the circumstances, Daniel had made the decisions that destroyed our marriage. He'd chosen to believe Sarah's lies over his pregnant wife's needs. He'd chosen to stay with another woman instead of being present for his family. "Sarah may have been manipulating the situation," I said, "but you were still the one who decided I wasn't worth fighting for." Daniel tried several more times to convince me that Sarah's manipulation changed the fundamental nature of what had happened between us. But I'd spent 3 years building a life without him. I'd raised our daughter to understand that families are made of people who show up, not people who abandon you during crises. "I forgive you," I told Daniel. "I understand that you were manipulated and that you've been carrying guilt about Sarah's death, but forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation." Daniel left that day understanding that some choices have permanent consequences, regardless of the circumstances that led to them. My daughter asked who the sad man was, and I told her honestly that he was someone from my past who'd made some mistakes and was trying to apologize. She seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to playing, secure in the knowledge that her current family was stable and reliable. That evening, I called my current boyfriend and told him about Daniel's visit and Sarah's confession letter. He listened without judgment, then asked if I was okay. "I'm fine," I said honestly. "It's good to know the truth, but it doesn't change anything about our life now." He agreed, and we spent the evening doing normal family things, making dinner, helping my daughter with her homework, reading bedtime stories. This is what stability looks like. People who show up every day, who prioritize your well-being, who don't abandon you when other people create drama. Sarah had been a master manipulator who destroyed multiple lives to get what she wanted, but she'd